I think we'll just make a start of that. Other people can come in as they get logged on. That'll be fine. Okay, so first of all, hello and welcome to this webinar. This is the 8th webinar in our new entrants and new start series. So this is the 8th and last one. The title is Crops and Climate Change. So following on neatly from last week's webinar, which was livestock and climate change. So, you know, just to round things off. My name is Malcolm MacDonald. I'm chairing this webinar this evening. I've got with me helping here is Robert Ramsey, who's another consultant with SAC. He's here to help answer the questions and generally keep things running smoothly. And our two speakers are Professor Bob Rees, who's a researcher with SRUC. Bob is head of carbon management at SRUC, and he's been involved in a great deal of research surrounding greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation in agriculture. And we've also got Professor Ian Bingham here, who's a researcher and lecturer with SRUC, who tends to look at crop disease and crop physiology. The rough plan for tonight is to aim to finish at 9. Might be 5 minutes either way, but that's what we're going to aim for. We will roughly be covering, briefly, very large topics, but just going over greenhouse gas emissions and reduction targets and how that sits in a kind of Scottish context, how these targets can be met, and how crops in Scotland might be affected by, you know, changes in climate. Some of you who are familiar with these webinars will be aware of this, but if you've got questions, we'll aim to have the presentations first and then questions at the end. So if you look at the right on your dashboard, you will see the questions pane. So you can just type in a question there, and then me or Robert will pick it up and we can put it to Bob or Ian at the end. Another, to keep things a bit interactive and keep you all paying attention, we've got a couple of polls to run throughout the course of the meeting, fairly self-explanatory. When they come up, I'll just run one in a second. The only thing is a few folk sometimes have trouble getting back into the webinar, so if that happens, just minimize it and then maximize it, and that should get you back into it. So I'll just run this first poll here, and you should see it in your screen in a minute. This is just to get your opinion on how you've seen the weather change in the last few years. That's good. So you've almost all voted now, so that's good. Okie doke. I will just share those results there. So we've got 61% saying yes, only 4% saying no, and 36% to some extent. So I think if you did the same exercise a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago from now, it would be very different. So that is quite interesting to see. Okay. So without further chat from me, I will hand over to Bob Rees, who's going to be our first speaker. And I'll just swap over screens, Bob.
Okay.
So there you go. That should be you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Right, I just need to sort the technology out and we'll be on our way. Can you see my screen?
Yep, that looks good, yeah. Good,
okay. So, yeah, thanks everybody for joining us this evening in this strange new world we find ourselves. With COVID going on, I think it's easy to forget that we're living through a climate change emergency at the moment. And behind the scenes, the Scottish Government are preparing some pretty ambitious plans to deal with this emergency, which is going to have big impacts for agriculture. And I thought it would be interesting just to say a few things about what these plans are and how we think it's going to impact on agriculture as we try to achieve the net zero targets that the government's been setting for ourselves. So the talk I'm going to give this evening is a sort of slimmed down version of a presentation I gave to the NFUS a few weeks ago. They've set up a committee to look at the implications of the net zero targets for agriculture in Scotland. And they're interested to hear about what the implications will be in terms of changing farming practice. And I'd like to acknowledge input to this work from some of my colleagues, particularly Vera Iori and Julian Bell at Edinburgh. So you're still seeing the slides, yeah? Okay. So I'll start by sort of framing this at the sort of global level and then working down to what the implications are here more locally. And I think globally we can think back 5 years to the major agreement that was made in Paris internationally to try to keep global temperature rises to less than 2 degrees centigrade, with ambition to go no more than 1.5 degrees. So that was about 5 years ago. Since then, there have been many lines of evidence to suggest that the 2 degrees of warming that was sort of considered in Paris was actually too much. And there are many lines of evidence saying that any rise above 1.5 degrees was going to be dangerous. And so the targets have been tightened since then. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually produced a report recommending that we go no further than 1.5 degrees of warming in order to avoid dangerous climate change. So what that means at a global level is that we have to very, very rapidly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Most of these come from carbon dioxide, but there are other gases in there as well, like methane and nitrous oxide, which come largely from agriculture. These all have to be reduced and brought down to net zero by the middle part of this century. So this graphic that I've got on the screen here shows you the pathway of emissions that we need to follow this century if we're going to even stand around a 50% chance of meeting this 1.5 degree target. And it says some interesting things. The black line is the net emissions, so that's the combination of emissions and removals. And it comes down very steeply as we move forward in the next few years. And it reaches zero around 2065 and then goes below zero in the second part of the century. And the other striking feature of this graph is that if you look at the zero line, then in the second part of the century, there's quite a bit of shading below the zero. And that implies that in order to meet our targets of this 1.5 degree limit, we actually have to actively start removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It's not just about mitigation. We have to mitigate, we have to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, but we also have to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in order to, as I say, avoid exceeding this 1.5 degree target. So these are incredibly ambitious plans. The other side of this graph, if you go back in history, shows a very steep rise. So we've got to turn this rise around and start bringing it down. And rather strangely this year, we've started to do this completely by accident as a result of COVID. We've started on this downward pathway. Whether or not once we recover from COVID, we'll be able to continue with this is over the question. So what does that mean in terms of UK policy and UK plans? So the UK has accepted the arguments provided by the international bodies, the IPCC and so on, and set a net zero target for 2050 in the UK. This is being done by the UK government as a whole, but also by the devolved authorities. The Scottish government is proposing a very similar policy with a Scottish target of net zero by 2045. And the idea of this policy of getting to net zero is that if this were replicated across the whole world, it would achieve an avoidance or 50% chance of avoidance of this exceedance of the 1.5 degrees centigrade global temperature rise, and therefore avoid what's considered to be dangerous climate change. So what's been happening in Scotland is that our emissions have been coming down over the past 20 years or so. If we go back to 1990, we were under the agreement of the Kyoto Protocol at that time, and we were trying to reduce our emissions as a consequence of signatories to the Kyoto Protocol. So emissions had already started to decline after 1990, particularly in the energy supply sector. But the emissions of greenhouse gases come from a variety of sources in the Scottish economy, and agriculture is quite a significant contributor to these. Agriculture on this graph sits here in the middle in this sort of orange line. And you'll see that one of the strange things about agriculture is that unlike some of the other sectors like energy, agriculture emissions have been pretty static over the last 20 years or so. There's really been little change in the last 10 years. And this is a concern because as we try to follow this very steep downward trajectory, all the emissions from all these different sectors have to come down. There are pretty ambitious plans in transport to bring down emissions, but agriculture doesn't really have the same level of ambition at the moment to bring these emissions down. And of course, agriculture is kind of different in a way as well. Agricultural emissions don't come so much from the burning of fossil fuels, they're biological emissions. And there's an argument that says that actually getting agricultural emissions down to zero is pretty much impossible. And we've got to put up with a certain level of emissions and offset what we can once we've got rid of all the unnecessary emissions. But the Scottish Government is committed to this issue of a climate emergency, and it's doing everything it can to try to reduce emissions across all sectors as far as possible. And given that agriculture is a pretty significant contributor to emissions, it's going to need to make a contribution. And there's an argument that goes that in actual fact, there are business opportunities to be made here because we're going to have an agricultural industry. And so the parts of the industry that are best able to adapt and reduce their emissions will be the bits of the industry that do best in the future. So there are some opportunities. So what's been happening over the last 10 years or so is that the UK has seen this coming. I mean, they've been trying to deal with the Kyoto Protocol and negotiate the Paris climate change agreement at the same time. And there was a realization that particularly in the agricultural sector, there was very poor accounting for the emissions that we have from agriculture. So they spent quite a lot of money and investment in R&D to try to understand and improve our understanding of greenhouse gas emissions, where they come from, how we account for them, in order to then develop a program of mitigation. So SRUC have played a major role in sort of contributing to this. We've been measuring emissions from nitrogen fertilizers, crops and soils, but also from the livestock sector and from land use change activities. And all this has helped improve our accounting of emissions, and we've got a much better idea now of where they come from. So for example, we've been looking at the use of fertilizers. Fertilizer nitrogen is a major source of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. And the more nitrogen you add to soils, the more emissions you get. So these bars at the bottom of this graph show you the response in terms of nitrous oxide emissions to increasing nitrogen fertilizer rates. And in different places, you get different responses. The Scottish site at Crichton down in the southwest actually has quite high emissions relative to some of the other sites. And Scotland generally tends to be associated with quite high nitrous oxide emissions, largely as a result of the sort of climatic conditions that we have. But we've been able to use this information to build up maps that show you where the highest emissions of nitrous oxide from fertilizers occur. So on the left-hand side of this picture, you see the sort of grassland situation, and on the right-hand side, it's the arable situation. So the darker areas represent areas of high emissions. And these higher emissions tend to be associated with wetter and higher rainfall sites. So the east of the country, where we actually grow most of the arable crops, is associated with much lower emissions, which is good news. But one of the issues that's become clear from the IPCC reporting and the Committee on Climate Change's work in this area that advised government is that the land use sector is going to be really critical, not only to delivering emission reductions from agriculture and land use, but actually contributing to the overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from the economy at large. Because other sectors of the economy, such as business and aviation, are going to depend on the land use sector to lock up some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. We need carbon sequestration from growing trees, from energy crops, from carbon capture and storage. So other sectors, as well as agriculture, are going to be depending on this sector to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And within the land use and agriculture sector, we need to get from a UK emission of around 60 million tonnes at the moment down to about 20 by 2050. So that's a major reduction in emissions from a whole range of activities that will go on in the agriculture and land use sector. And I'll just mention a few of these and some of the things that we've been looking at. So the nice thing about agriculture is that agriculture is a very managed system, and almost anything we do in terms of management will influence greenhouse gas emissions. And we could come up with a list of hundreds of management operations and say something about how each of them would influence emissions. But there are some really clear things that we do or have an opportunity to do that can be important. So growing woodlands is an obvious one. Woodlands lock up lots of carbon from the atmosphere, so anything that we can do to plant more trees will help. But there are other things such as precision farming, soil management, AD, the management of feeds for livestock, use of legumes in arable rotations, slurry management, fertilizer inhibitors, and other things that we can do that all have an impact. And we've looked at all of these things and tried to quantify their impact, because we're going to need to apply more than one technique in order to achieve the sort of mitigation that we're looking for. And one of the ways that we've done this is a rather complicated slide, but I'll sort of try and simplify it, is to try to combine the cost of an intervention with the amount of carbon it will save. So the cost of the intervention is represented by the vertical scale on this graph, and the amount of carbon that you save is represented on the horizontal scale. And we can then quantify lots of different measures and look at how effective they are in terms of carbon mitigation, but also quantify how much they cost, because the more money you throw at this, the more you can mitigate. The things that curve below zero are things that we ought to be doing anyway. They're cost-effective efficiency measures, essentially. They make the farm more efficient, so they're sort of things we ought to be doing anyway, such as more efficient management of feeds and fertilizers, but they also save carbon. As you go to the right of this graph, you get to more expensive measures, and depending on how much money the government's willing to put into this, we could move quite a long way to the right and save a lot more carbon doing things like that. So let me just give you an example of one measure that we've looked at, and this is one of dozens, but it's an example of something that's fairly simple to do that could achieve quite significant greenhouse gas emission savings. So legumes are plants that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. They provide a nitrogen input to the soil that doesn't depend on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And synthetic nitrogen fertilizers are quite significant sources of greenhouse gases, both because we have to produce greenhouse gases to manufacture them, but also because when we apply them to the soils, they release this nitrous oxide emission, which is quite a significant part of agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gases. So by replacing monoculture grasslands with more grass clover swards, or by including legumes in arable rotations, there are opportunities to significantly reduce our N2O emissions, and we've tried to quantify this at a national scale. The problem, however, is that when we add all these mitigations together, particularly the cost-effective ones, we don't get enough mitigation potential to meet the government's targets. So by adding all these things together, and it's a long list, longer than the one that I've shown, we can identify about 7 million tonnes of cost-effective mitigation by halfway between now and 2050, but we're looking for something like 37 to 40 million tonnes of CO2 mitigation by 2050, so we're a long way off that target. The question is, what can we do about this? One thing is to try to get more mitigation, so maybe more R&D, put more money into it, get more savings that way. Another option is to say, well, we can't get any more mitigation because we just have to accept there are emissions with this sort of agriculture, and what we have to do is get more greenhouse gas removal, so we have to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And a third option would be to say, well, you know, on the supply side, as far as farming is concerned, the emissions that you get depend on what it is you're asking for. So if you ask for very carbon intensive products like beef and sheep and meat, these are products that are associated with high emissions, then we're bound to have a high emission in the farming sector. However, if you change demand and that you move to a less meat-based diet, you would reduce emissions in that way. So there are three very different options. In fact, we're probably going to have to use all of them to get to the sort of ambitious level of targets that the government are setting. But I want to show you an example of how that works in practice. So what we did was we took us what we considered to be a typical farm in the centre of Scotland. It was a mixed farming enterprise with the sort of baseline emissions that we see at the moment in Scotland. And we did a modelling exercise to look at how introducing a whole series of mitigations could take us towards a net zero target on this farm. The idea was to get the farm down to completely zero emissions. So you have to do this in two stages. You mitigate all the emissions that you can. You introduce all these efficiency measures and use inhibitors and so on. That gets you down so far, and you're left with a residual emission that you can't get rid of. And that bit then you have to deal with by sequestration and removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So that was the plan, and this was the outcome. So on the left-hand side of this graph, you see the farm's net CO2 emissions, and then we introduce a whole series of mitigations, improving productivity for the livestock, introducing legumes that I mentioned, using inhibitors, and this brings your emissions down by about 30% or so. So still way off the zero target. The zero is the bottom of these bars. So that next bit has to be dealt with by greenhouse gas removals. The first bit is afforestation. So you choose bits of the farm to plant woodland on. We didn't need that much woodland on this farm. It wasn't too significant, but the area that we used still wasn't enough to bring the target down to net zero. And the remaining bit, we had to use another technology called biochar, which is a sort of charcoal-based material that you can create from straw, which was produced on the farm. And by using that biochar and carbon sequestration together, we got down to a net zero target. So it was hard work, but we got there. And it's not necessarily a model that we'd use everywhere in Scotland, but it demonstrates that there is an opportunity. And it's worth just mentioning a little bit about carbon sequestration, because the less we're able to mitigate, if we're not able to get this mitigation potential that we're looking for, carbon sequestration is going to be really important. And soils in Scotland are very carbon rich. So there's maybe an opportunity for carbon sequestration here. In fact, they contain about 3,000 million tonnes of carbon in Scotland. The problem is that when we look at sort of what's been happening in Scottish soils, we actually see over the past 20 years or so, there's been very little change in the carbon stocks of our major areas of agriculture, of arable and grassland soils across Scotland. This is a survey that was done by James Hutton Institute, showing relatively modest change. So it could be difficult to get a lot more carbon into our soils because they're so carbon rich. The other thing I mentioned was demand side approaches. So the issue of dietary change, and this graph simply shows the difference in carbon emissions associated with different products. So the meat products here, the left-hand side of the graph, have sometimes 10 or 100 times the emissions associated with some of the plant-based materials. So you can see that dietary change could lead to quite significant shifts in carbon emissions as a result of different patterns of consumption. So I'll finish there. It's a very brief overview of some of the work we've been doing, but I think the main point is that we're on a pathway which is going to involve major change to society as a whole, but agriculture is not going to be immune from that. Agriculture is going to be central to the changes we're seeking in order to achieve climate change mitigation. And agriculture has a particular problem because it's always going to be associated with emissions. And what we need to do is get rid of some of the residuals through some of these techniques that I've been talking about, like carbon sequestration. We're going to need multiple technologies to do this, and land use is going to be critical. So I'll finish there. Sorry if I've overrun by a minute or two. But,
No, I think that's fine, Bob. You're okay. Thanks for that. Very informative. A lot of information in it too. Just on the back of that, I've got another quick poll to launch just to get people's thoughts on carbon mitigation. So I'll launch that now. You should all see it on your screens, hopefully. Okay, we're getting there. Most folk have voted, almost. Okay, I'll just close this and then share the results. So, actively considering carbon mitigation in your farming practices, we got 43% are yes there. That's quite positive. 18% are no, fair enough, and 39% somewhat, I suppose, probably thinking about it. I suppose the challenge is often, apart from planting trees, is what is the best thing to do to mitigate carbon as a whole. It's a whole big question. So no, that's interesting. That's good. I'll hand over to Ian now. I'll just get your screen up, Ian. That's good. I can see your screen now. It's grand.
Okay, I can see it now. Right, thank you, Malcolm, and good evening, everybody. I mean, Bob has given a nice presentation there about some of the things that we need to do in order to mitigate climate change. But the other thing that we need to think about is that we need to think about how we can then adapt to some of the changes that are almost certainly going to occur. So what I'd like to cover in this session is the effect that climate change is expected to have on UK crop yield potential. Sorry, I should be on that slide. And then consider the role that root systems may have in helping us to adapt to these changes. And the Met Office have published projections on the different greenhouse gas emission scenarios with global mean temperature rises of 2 or 4 degrees C. And the sort of headline predictions from these are that we are expecting to see warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and more frequent extreme events. Now, with all sort of weather predictions, climate predictions, there's a large amount of uncertainty around these, and especially for rainfall. The projected changes are expected to differ across the UK. So this graph here, or this set of graphs, just shows you some of the predictions for rainfall. And you can see that the reduction in rainfall in the summer is expected to be more pronounced down here in the south of the UK compared to the north. And equally, the predicted increase in winter rainfall is expected to be greater in the south compared to the north. And these different panels really reflect some of the uncertainty that surrounds these predictions. So the question is then, well, what impact can we expect this to have on our crop yield potentials? Well, future UK climate is expected to remain favourable for wheat production. That was the conclusion from a study published earlier this year by a group at Rothamsted and Reading. And it's perhaps in line with what we find with other crops as well, predictions for other crops. So it's not just for wheat. And I think what it reflects is the fact that we have some negative effects that we're expecting from climate change, but some of those can be offset by some of the positive things. So actually an increase in the CO2 concentration from a plant point of view can be helpful because it can increase the efficiency of photosynthesis. But if we project if we take those projections further into the future to the end of the century, and particularly if there is no mitigation at all, so that the emissions are allowed to continue unchecked, then the picture, the projection is a little bit more gloomy. So some studies have suggested that cropping in the south of the UK might be unsustainable. But if we think about 2050, think about the climate that we might be expecting here, because of the warmer weather, then that will have an effect on the rate of crop development. And so that can mean an earlier flowering date and an earlier maturity date by around two weeks. The severity of drought, if these models were done using an available water capacity in the soil of 180 millimeters, and the severity of drought that was predicted there around flowering was actually going to be lower. Our drought around flowering is actually particularly critical because it can lead to pollen sterility and a reduction in grain set. Now, the reason why the severity is expected to be lower is because of the faster rate of crop development. So the crop will reach flowering earlier before it's had time to exhaust all the available soil water. The prediction for prolonged water stress, that's water stress that goes on for longer into the grain filling period, that was expected to be a small rise. And the effect on, oops, sorry, I've just lost my screen. The effect on heat stress was expected to be minimal. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm trying to move this little box, so I'm going to minimize that. Just one moment. The risk of extreme weather conditions early in the season so extreme wet weather early in the season is predicted to be higher, but the risk of adverse soil conditions that would affect sort of operations such as harvesting and sowing was expected to be lower, and that's because the soil conditions are after a dry summer, and so they'll be able to traffic better. I'm sorry, Malcolm, I'm having trouble here with this GoToWebinar thing. I can't see my slides. Right. Oh. Okay. Apologies, everybody. Right, I've got it moved to one end now, so hopefully I can carry on. So how do we improve resilience? Well, I think what these predictions are showing is that there are a number of threats. We are likely to experience more waterlogging over the winter and spring months. The heavier rainfall could lead to greater nitrate leaching. Drought will be an issue, and it's going to be more severe on those soils that have a relatively low water holding capacity, either because they're shallow soils or they're light textured soils. And because of the warmer, wetter weather, we're likely to see an increase in sort of disease over the early part of the season. So the kind of actions that we must be thinking about then would be to try and maximize infiltration and drainage through ensuring good soil structure, possibly looking at ways in which we can increase the tolerance of crops to temporary waterlogging. We need to think about how we manage that nitrogen leaching risk through our fertilizer management practices, nitrogen residue management, maximizing the efficiency of crop nitrogen capture. And for drought, if we can increase the crop's access to water, that would help. That might involve having to consider irrigation, but if that's not possible, then we need to look at ways to reduce crop water use. For the early season disease, then what we're looking at here really are sort of robust integrated pest management measures. Now that it involves a lot of that involves root systems. Root systems will have a role to play in helping us adapt to these changes. But what kind of root system do we require? Well, most crops don't actually require larger root systems. But it's the root distribution that's important. And what we have here is a graph that shows you the root length density versus the soil depth. So it's depth down in the soil profile. And this graph here in blue is a crop for a crop of wheat at flowering time, and this vertical line shows you the critical root length density for capture of the available water and nitrate. And what we can see is that the root length density in the topsoil is more than enough to capture that available water and nitrate. But where it becomes limiting is below a depth of about 50 to 60 centimeters. So it's in this area down here in the subsoil below that depth that we need to try and increase rooting if we want to capture, make more water available to the crop, but also capture some of that, that leached nitrate. So is that going to be possible? Well, it really depends on your soil. So it's really important for growers to know your soil, know what the capacity of your system is. Here we have a soil profile that was taken from a site in Montrose, and it was a sandy loam soil over a loamy sand subsoil at about 50 centimeters. And you can see there's lots of roots here in the topsoil, but nothing penetrating into the subsoil because the sand was just too densely packed. With the weight of the topsoil above it, those roots simply weren't able to penetrate. So there's nothing we can do here to actually increase rooting depth. But there'll be other soils where there may be some restrictions to rooting that can be rectified, things like plough pans. So it's important to know your soil and know what you're dealing with. So really important to ensure that we have good soil structure and to remove sort of restrictions to rooting growth. And I've put this slide in just to illustrate that this is important not just when water and nutrients might be limiting, but also when they're not limiting. And what we did in this experiment was to grow some barley plants with roots that were restricted by having a fine mesh that would allow water and nutrients to pass through and gases, but not the roots. And then our control boxes were where we grew plants with a mesh that allowed the roots to grow through. So this provided sort of shallow rooting here, and this provided deeper rooting. And those were done with and without fertilizer and with irrigation to make sure that the water was non-limiting. And we can see here that the shallow rooted crops had a lower shoot biomass, above ground biomass, both with the fertilizer and without the fertilizer. And these are not due to water and nutrient restrictions, nitrogen restrictions. So we think what's going on here is when those roots hit an impenetrable layer, they send hormonal signals up to the shoot that then slows down the growth. So it's important to try and remove these restrictions and maintain good soil structure even in these kind of conditions. And there are plenty of guides and tools available now. I mean, there's been an increased awareness now amongst farmers, I think, over the last 10 years or so, through the activities of ourselves at SRUC and the AHDB and elsewhere. And there are tools to allow farmers to examine their soils, things like the visual evaluation of soil structure for the topsoil and the subsoil. And then there are good guides that explain the principles of soil management and how that can be used in practice. And hopefully with those kind of guides, then we can avoid situations where we have compaction here and produce good soil structures as shown here. So in addition to ensuring that we've got a good soil structure, and that's going to be important not only for maximizing rooting depth and preventing, and helping the crop through potential drought limitations, it'll also be important for aiding sort of infiltration of water and drainage. But are there other things that we can do to manage a root system? What about standard agronomy? Probably a little bit less known about some of these things. Sowing date, we know if crops are sown earlier, roots will grow sooner. You can end up with a larger root system by flowering, by doing that, but it doesn't necessarily lead to deeper rooting. Deeper rooting early in the season, but not necessarily by flowering. The later sown crops could effectively catch up. There has been a little bit of work or suggestions that earlier sowing can get the crop well established before temporary waterlogging. That might increase the tolerance to waterlogging. Fungicides can have effects on root systems as well. So fungicides will keep roots growing for a little bit longer through the grain filling period. And we found that fungicides like prothioconazole can increase the nitrogen uptake efficiency in barley. There's been a lot of interest, or there was some years ago, around plant growth regulators and whether plant growth regulators can boost rooting. Modus was being promoted as one of these that might do that. We did some work on this in lysimeters and in the field, and we weren't able to find any reliable evidence to suggest that there was any kind of significant effect on rooting. So what about biostimulants? Well, they're quite popular products at the moment, and there's a range of different product types from seaweed extracts, phosphites, amino acids, microbial inoculants, and a range of claimed benefits. So depending on the product, the claims are that they improve root growth, they improve stress tolerance, they improve the recovery from stress, and they can improve nutrient capture. And these are all things that you might expect to be beneficial if you're dealing with potential droughts in the summer, or recovering and tolerating periods of waterlogging. So how good is the evidence? Well, there's certainly some fairly convincing evidence from the scientific literature that some of these things can have a physiological effect. So this is just some data that's showing the effects of potassium phosphite on wheat. And the phosphite isn't broken down into phosphate, it's not converted. So this is not a nutritional effect from phosphate, but you can see that it's data taken from the University of Nottingham, and you can see that there was a significant increase in the sort of growth of the root system, the biomass of the root system, and you can see that growth here in the photograph. And they followed this up by looking at what some of the causes of this might be, and it's associated with changes in the plant hormone balance and an increase in cytokinin production. So I think there is good evidence that there are physiological effects resulting from at least some groups of biostimulants, but what we're lacking is evidence of their efficacy under UK field conditions. And this was the conclusion reached by Kate Storer in a review for the AHDB in 2016. And more recently, a group of farmers under the Yield Enhancement Network were looking at yield responses to amino acid applications, and the conclusions from that work is that there weren't any significant responses that they found. They were essentially unconvincing. There are very few measurements on root systems done with biostimulants under UK field conditions, so I think we need a lot more testing under defined conditions of waterlogging and water stress to be able to draw any kind of strong conclusions. And I think it's important to recognize that just because you don't find an effect on yield doesn't mean to say there isn't a physiological effect taking place on the root system. It might be that physiological effect just doesn't lead to any great benefit in terms of yield, perhaps because they're not being tested under the right conditions. So testing these things under defined conditions in the field will be important. What about varieties? Well, we know that there is genotypic variation in a wide range of potentially useful traits. So we know that genotypes differ in their ability to produce air spaces in the roots, and this can be helpful in terms of tolerating waterlogging. We know that they can differ in extension rate and root angle, which might promote deeper rooting. And we know that there is variation in the ability of roots to deplete soil nitrogen. And this is what's shown here in this panel. So we compared oats, a variety Firth, and with a range of barley genotypes, and oats were able to deplete mineral nitrogen from the subsoil to a greater extent than barley, but there was also useful variation amongst the barley genotypes. And this kind of thing could be quite useful in managing the nitrogen residues and minimizing problems with nitrate leaching at the end of the season. Now, given that we have all this genotypic variation, why is it we don't see varieties that are specifically designed for root traits? Why isn't this information available for farmers to be able to select suitable varieties? Well, the main problem is really because of the difficulty in measuring and selecting root traits in large breeding populations in the field. So if we're dealing with hundreds of different lines in a breeding program, it's incredibly difficult to make those kind of measurements in any kind of meaningful way. So there's been a lot of work trying to develop screens to measure root traits in seedlings, and there are some examples here. This is roots growing against a glass plate that you can visualize, and these are X-ray CAT scans that give a non-destructive three-dimensional image, and this is some work that was done by a PhD student of ours. But in each case, they're still time-consuming to do, and one of the main difficulties is that just because you see characteristics that might appear to be useful in a seedling or in a young plant, they don't always translate into meaningful differences out in the field, because we have a lot of variation between soil conditions, between sites, and different soil types. So I don't think we're going to see, or it's going to be a few years before we start to see specific varieties being introduced with sort of specific root traits. I think progress will be more rapid in the use of technology. I think there is potential to improve the precision of water and nitrogen management by coupling crop simulation models to improvements in sensors, so we can measure in real time things like soil moisture and nitrate concentrations. And crop simulations are rarely used in sort of farm management, although there are some examples now coming through. But if they can be simplified and coupled to these kind of sensors, then I think there is potential. And I just want to end by just looking at one example of that. And this is in the use of anti-transpirants. And these are compounds that help reduce transpiration from leaves by forming films across them or inducing stomatal closure. But one of the problems that might be beneficial in a drought situation because it reduces water loss, but one of the problems is that it also slows down CO2 uptake, so it actually reduces photosynthesis. So if you don't apply them under the right conditions, if the plant isn't water stressed, they can actually reduce yield. But they do have benefits in terms of increasing yield when the crop is water stressed. So you can imagine a situation where where the drought sensitive period you want to protect is around flowering. If you have a model that is able to continually predict when flowering is approaching, and then that's coupled to a measure of the soil moisture deficit, you'd be able to time that anti-transpirant application when it's most needed, if it's needed at all. So I'd like to end there with some conclusions. So I think UK crop yield will remain high, potential yield will remain high, especially in the north. There are threats from early season waterlogging, potential nitrate leaching, summer drought and disease that we need to be aware of and try and deal with. Adaptation measures, I think, will have to be tailored to local soil conditions and the soil's potential. And I think maintaining soil health and good soil structure is an essential sort of building block in all this, although there are opportunities for increasing precision of water and nitrogen management to aid climate adaptation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. That was very informative. I think we're okay for time. Well, we've got a few time for a couple of questions anyway, so I'll just hand over to Robert, who's going to...
We've got a few good questions that have come in here, and there's loads of time or loads of opportunity here to stick a few more questions in the question panel. So I'm sure after two presentations like that, there's more to come. But to open, I'd just like to ask Bob, Did the net zero model on that mixed farm, was it still a mixed farm by the end of it, or had all the ruminant animals been taken out of the equation?
Oh no, the idea was to keep production as much as possible as it was initially. So we kept the animals on the farm. So we needed those removals at the end from the carbon sequestration and the biochar to offset the residuals, but we kept the livestock on the farm.
Yeah, excellent. That the beef specialist in me is why that had to be asked first.
Yeah.
And what, again on that one, probably to you both, would be what role do ruminants have in managing and improving arable soils? You know, are they a key, have they got a huge impact on improving arable soils, or can we do arable systems without ruminants on them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So, I mean, you know, I was focusing very narrowly, I guess, on the greenhouse gas emissions, but you do have to think of the wider system. And livestock undoubtedly play an important role in managing biodiversity, in managing soil quality, and so on. I mean, if they're managed wrongly, then those things are damaged. But correct management of livestock can enhance soil quality by the use of slurries and manures, applications to soils, and can improve biodiversity. So, I mean, these things need to be considered overall, I think, when we look at the sort of farm management plans as we move forward.
Yeah, Ian, have you anything to add on that?
No, I would agree. I mean, they're an important source of you know, soil conditioning, as well as additions of organic matter. So no, but if you get the management wrong, you know, and you lead to poaching, breakdown, you've got soil compaction issues, then of course that's going to make life more difficult.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think on this one we'll go, Ian, you mentioned about extremes of weather, and I know it's predictions, so we can't see exactly what that's going to look like. The extremes we saw, so last winter, I think across the whole country, we saw an extremely wet winter, followed by an extremely, and very abruptly, an extremely dry spring. Is that what we're talking about? Is that extremes, or is there more to come?
Well, it's a difficult thing to say. I would guess those are the kind of extremes, but when you talk about extremes, you can talk about probabilities, you know, in terms of how many years in 20 you might expect to see that. I don't have, because I'm not a climate modeler, you know, a finger on the pulse of that. Maybe Bob would be able to answer it, but that is the kind of pattern that we're more likely to see, or we're likely to see more often. But it's not going to be every year. I mean, some winters will likely be drier than we see now. But it's that fluctuation between sort of wet and dry in the summer that we're going to have to be better able to manage when it comes along, I think.
It's developing that resilient business, isn't it?
It is, I think.
And
Yeah.
one of the other things to bear in mind is the sort of scenarios that we see in the future will depend upon the emissions pathway that we follow.
Yes. Yes.
So, you know, if we were successful globally at mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, these extremes would be less likely. At the moment, we're following the most extreme pathway. So we're following the 8.5 RCP that you highlighted in your graphs, Ian, which will lead to more extremes.
Yes. Yes.
So again, to both of you, if you had the choice, would you have a well-managed woodland or a well-managed grass sward to capture carbon? Who would like to go first? I won't put anybody on the spot.
Well, I mean, a well-managed woodland would probably capture more carbon than a well-managed grassland. The problem with grasslands is that after a while they get to an equilibrium. I mean, grasslands are good at capturing carbon, but after a while they can't take any more because the amount they release is equal to the amount going in. It takes woodlands a bit longer to get there. So, and if we use the wood for products that are stored for a long time, then that's also a form of carbon storage. So woodlands tend to be more effective, but the problem is we still need to produce food. So we can't plant the whole of Scotland with trees if we're going to carry on producing food. And the Scottish government is pretty committed to producing food, so we have to get a balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Another good question here is, what role does ploughing have on a crop established by ploughing versus maybe minimum tillage? What role does ploughing have on carbon emissions? Either Ian.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'll hand it over to Bob, because as a soil scientist, I mean, ploughing will tend to reduce the organic matter content because you're disturbing the soil, whereas a minimum tillage will reduce that. But then there are whole issues about how successful that establishment process is going to be, because in order to maximize the yield, then we need good establishment, and high yielding crops have got the lowest carbon footprint. So good establishment will be important. So I think it's horses for courses. I don't know, Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
This is a really contentious issue, and if you want to get an argument from the soil scientist, just ask this question. The problem, I mean, it used to be thought that if you had zero till, min till, you'd increase carbon storage and carbon sequestration. But in a lot of measurements on this recently, and it seems like what's happening generally is that by min till or reduced till, you increase the carbon concentration at the surface, but you kind of cause a redistribution of the carbon. So you don't get the carbon going quite so low down in the soil as when you're ploughing. So actually the total carbon stock doesn't change all that much. And it changes a lot less than we used to think it did. So the effect of tillage on carbon storage is probably not as important as we used to think. And there are other impacts as well on nitrous oxide emission, which make it even more complex. And to some extent, it seems like the net greenhouse gas balance depends on the type of soil that you've got. So it's not a simple answer. It's very sort of site dependent.
Yeah, and if it leads to lower yields, which it can do if it's not done correctly, then the gains that you're making by trying to sequester more or lose less carbon, you're kind of reducing, you're negating that by having a lower yield. You're fixing less because the crop growth is reduced.
We should maybe keep that question and have a whole other webinar on it because it's such a vast, such an interesting topic. Another question here is, it seems that we lose vital agrochemicals every year, or it feels like it anyway. How can farmers reduce carbon costs of cropping while losing these key chemicals? Ian.
Yeah. So if by key chemicals we're talking about pesticides,
I would assume yes.
I guess yes. Yeah, I mean, ensuring, I mean, disease control is really important. I mean, and if we're looking at the greenhouse gas costs of production, then maintaining high yields by eliminating or preventing disease or loss of yield through disease is critical. I guess IPM measures will be important. We are losing chemistry. That is something that we have to live with. But if we can take the pressure off some of those the fungicides and the pesticides by having integrated approaches, managing them so we're not losing resistance, managing them so we're not overusing certain active ingredients, so there's sort of less chance of them being removed through regulation, then that has got to help going forward. But I think integrated measures where we're looking to combine resistant varieties, we're looking to minimize the development of the epidemics, we might be using elicitors as part of the armory. I think that is the way forward. But I'm not undermining, I'm not sort of underestimating the challenge that's associated with that.
And do you think GM would come into that? We're looking at a major change in agricultural policy and direction that farming has to go in. Do you think GM has a part to play in this?
Well, GM has the potential to increase resistance, I guess. It's not something I've dealt that much with myself, but the technologies are there. But it all hinges on then the market acceptance of it, doesn't it? You know, so it may have a role to play in terms of production, but is the market going to take it? Because if it's not, then I can't see personally. I can't see it getting the green light.
Yep. Yep. And I think, conscious of time, there's a lot of good questions coming in just now, and really interesting ones. So I think we'll try what we haven't covered. We'll get to the speakers as well and see if we can get an answer, a more full answer for you as well. But just finally to you both would be, can the UK be self-sufficient in food production and also be net zero for agriculture? Bob.
Well, I mean, we're not self-sufficient in food production at the moment, so it's difficult to see how we could achieve this with the net zero target. I mean, you know, I think one of the points Ian was making is that actually climate change provides both threats and opportunities. So if you look at the UK in a global sense, it's one of the places that's actually going to improve in terms of productivity. In Scotland in particular, land use capability is going to improve. So there are opportunities, and we need to take advantage. We shouldn't think of climate change as being something that's going to close down agriculture, almost the reverse. But clearly there are also threats, and agriculture is going to have to change to deal with the policy environment that we're working in.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Ian, have you any thoughts on that?
No, just to add to what Bob was saying, the opportunities are that we might see a bigger diversity of cropping potential. You know, so you know, we might start to see much more vegetable growth and satisfy the UK market that way.
Yeah. So embrace the opportunities rather than moan about the challenges.
Yeah, because I mean the rest of Europe, the same research group with the paper I showed about wheat, they did similar projections for other parts of Europe, and it's you know, a much more gloomy picture in Europe, where, you know, more severe droughts around the Mediterranean. So I think, you know, coming back to what Bob was saying, you know, we're actually pretty lucky, but in the north of the country here, that that things are not going to be so bad, I don't think. I mean, there are opportunities, and you know, we do have a favourable environment for crop production.
Yeah, it's a shame, because on that note, there's another couple of questions on global issues, greenhouse gas issues, and population growth and things. Very good questions, but we're not going to get to them, unfortunately. We've reached the end of our allotted time, so I'll thank you for allowing me for my contribution, thank the speakers, and pass you back to Malcolm.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Thank you for that, and thank you to Ian and Bob. I don't have too much to add now. Just very quickly, of course, if this was an in-person meeting, we'd have evaluation forms. Those are still there. They're just online now. So if you have a spare minute, you'll get an email tomorrow, I think. It should come into you. If you follow that link and fill out the evaluation form, so we know what we're doing well, what to improve on, that would be grand. And apart from that, just thank you again to Bob and Ian and Robert for your time and your presentations. Very informative stuff. And there's so many questions. It's a massive topic. We're never going to fit, you know, everything you could say into an hour, but I think we got quite a lot of good stuff there. So with that, thank you, everybody. And yes. This webinar has also been recorded. So if you do want to watch it again, or somebody missed it, it will be on the Farm Advisory website, along with all other webinars too. So they're all there. Okay, with that, thank you, and thank you for logging on, everybody. Cheers,
Thank you
guys.
very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.